The freight sled came into Frostpine Relay with one horse, half mad in the traces, and a woman standing beside the driver like she had been waiting for trouble her whole life. The lead mare screamed once. Not loud enough to be grand. Just sharp enough to stop every hand near the hitching rail. A chain had slipped under the breast strap. The driver cursed. A clerk backed away. Someone near the post office laughed too early. Then swallowed it when the horse struck the frozen ground hard enough to rattle the sled boards. Tobias Vale stepped off the porch of the relay station. He was nearly there when the woman moved first. She did not rush the animal. She did not grab for the bridle or shout like men did when fear made them want to sound useful. She set down her carpetbag in the snow, pulled one glove tight with her teeth, and came in from the side where the mare could see her. "Easy," she said. Not sweet. Not soft. Steady. The horse's eye rolled white. The driver said, "Ma'am, you best leave that." She lifted one hand without looking at him. The driver shut his mouth. Tobias stopped where he was. The woman reached the mare's shoulder, waded through one hard breath, then another, and slipped her fingers under the twisted strap. The chain had bit deep into the harness leather. She worked it loose without forcing it. The mare trembled under her hand, but did not bolt. "There," the woman said. The chain dropped. The whole sled seemed to breathe. Only then did she step back and pick up her bag. Tobias looked at her properly. She was not dressed like a mountain woman, but she did not stand like a town woman either. Her gray coat was worn thin at the cuffs. Her bonnet had been tied for travel, not beauty. A narrow shawl lay around her shoulders, the hem stitched too carefully, too many times, as if the edge held something more important than thread. Her eyes moved over Frostpine Relay once. Door, window, stable, back road, then him. "Tobias Vale?" she asked. Her voice was low, even, and tired in a way sleep would not fix. "I am." She nodded once. "Elspeth Rowan." No one at the relay spoke for a moment. So this was the woman from the agency letter. The woman who had crossed half a territory to marry a timberman she had never met, carrying one carpetbag, one stitched shawl, and a face that did not ask the world for kindness. Tobias took one step closer and stopped where there was still room between them. "You had a hard road," he said. "I have had worse." She did not say it for pity. She said it like a fact about weather. Behind them, the relay clerk opened the office door too hard. The wood slapped against the wall. Elspeth's shoulders tightened, only for a breath. Then she was still again. Tobias saw it. He looked away before she knew he had seen too much. "There's coffee inside," he said. "Stew, if Orrin hasn't burned it. Road to my cabin takes 2 hours. Longer, if the ice has come over the ridge. I can ride now." "You can," Tobias said, "but you shouldn't start a mountain road hungry." She studied him as if the sentence might have a hook hidden in it. Then she picked up her bag. Inside the relay station, heat pushed from a black iron stove, Orrin Bell, who owned the counter and most of the gossip for 30 miles, ladled stew into 2 tin bowls without being asked. Elspeth sat with her back near the wall, not touching it. Near enough. Tobias noticed that too. He sat across from her, leaving the table's width between them, and picked up his spoon first. She waited until he had taken a bite before she touched hers. "The cabin has 2 rooms," he said. "Main room with the stove. Sleeping room at the back. You'll have that room. I'll take the cot by the fire until we know what this arrangement is." Her spoon stopped. For the first time, she looked at him longer than a blink. "That is decent of you. It is practical," he said. "We are strangers." Something in her face shifted, but did not open. Not yet. Outside, the mare gave a low, uneasy sound. Elspeth turned her head toward it before any of the men did. Tobias set his spoon down. "You know horses." "I know fear," she said. The words landed on the table between them and stayed there. Neither of them reached for them. When they came back outside, the driver had tied the freed chain to the sled rail. Tobias reached for Elspeth's carpet bag, then stopped before his hand touched it. "May I?" She looked at his hand, then at his face. Yes. He loaded it into the wagon bed carefully, like it had weight beyond clothing. Elspeth climbed up beside him without help. She chose the side where she could see the south road behind them. Tobias took the reins. Frost pine relay shrank in the cold behind them. The stove smoke thinning into the pines. Ahead, the mountain road bent upward into black timber and white ground. Elspeth kept one gloved hand on the stitched hem of her shawl. Tobias did not ask why. But before the first mile passed, he understood one thing clearly. This woman had not come west looking for a husband. She had come west, measuring the distance between herself and whatever still knew her name. Black larch cabins stood at the bend of a frozen creek, 2 rooms under a low roof, with a lean-to for horses and a woodpile stacked higher than the window. Elspeth saw all of it before Tobias stopped the wagon. The door, the creek, the barn wall, the timber behind the house, the trail they had come in on. Tobias noticed her counting without moving her lips. He climbed down first and tied the team to the rail. "That's the cabin." She looked at it the way some women looked at a church before entering. Not with comfort, with measurement. "It holds heat?" she asked. "If the stove is fed and the north wall is chinked right." "Is it?" It was this morning. That answer seemed to satisfy her more than any promise would have. She stepped down from the wagon before he could offer a hand. Her boots struck the hard snow, and she stood still for half a breath, testing the ground as if even earth had to prove itself. Tobias took her carpet bag from the wagon and carried it to the porch. He did not take the shawl. Elspeth kept one hand on its stitched hem all the way inside. The cabin was plain. A table, 2 chairs, a stove, pegs on the wall, a rifle above the shelf, a workbench under the side window, a cot folded near the hearth. The sleeping room stood behind a real plank wall with a door that shut clean. Elspeth looked at the wall first, then the latch. Tobias set her carpet bag beside the sleeping room door. "That room is yours." She turned to him. "And yours." "The cot? For how long?" "Until you decide different." Her face changed very little, but her hand loosened on the shawl. "That may be a while," she said. "Then it will be a while." No kindness in his voice. No injury either. Just a thing set down square. Elspeth removed her gloves and laid them on the table. "Folded evenly. What needs doing before dark? Nothing that can't wait." That is rarely true. He almost smiled. "Fire's low. Water bucket is half. Horses need bedding checked. Supper can be plain." She nodded once, as if a map had been handed to her. By the time Tobias came back from the lean-to, the stove door was open. The ashes had been pulled forward, and Elspeth had the fire drawing steady. She had found the kindling box, the damper, the split pine, and the place where he kept the iron poker without asking. "You've handled stoves," he said. "I've handled cold." Again, not complaint. Fact. She filled the kettle, wiped the table, moved 2 sacks of meal away from the damp wall, and set his scattered nails into a chipped cup by size. Tobias watched from the doorway and understood that she was not making herself at home. Not yet. She was making herself useful enough to be allowed to stay. That sat wrong in him. Supper was beans, coffee, and rough bread from the relay wrapped in cloth. Elspeth waited again until he ate first. He did not mention it. He only broke the bread, put half near her bowl, and kept his eyes on his own plate. Afterward, she stood before he did. I'll wash. I can do it." "I know." She stopped, caught by that answer. Tobias took the bowls to the basin. Behind him, she remained standing, unsure what to do with hands that had been excused from work. So she found work anyway. She lifted the small lamp, crossed to the shelf, and began putting his supply tins in order. Flour, salt, coffee, dried apples, cartridges. She paused at those, then moved them to the top shelf, where they would stay dry. "You don't like idle shelves," Tobias said. "I don't trust disorder." He let that stand. That night, Elspeth carried her carpet bag into the sleeping room. Before closing the door, she looked back once at the main room. Stove, window, table, Tobias by the basin. "Good night," she said. "Good night, Elspeth." The door closed. A moment later, the latch slid into place. Tobias did not move for a long while. The next morning he woke before dawn and found the stove already alive. Coffee sat on the table. Elspeth stood by the window with her shawl around her shoulders, looking past the yard toward the dark line of timber. "You've been out," he said. She turned. "Only to the creek bend. That's near the boundary." "I wanted to know where it was." He poured coffee slowly. "Boundary stakes run east to the old pine, south to the creek stone, west along the ridge fence. I saw 3 stakes," she said. "The 4th is leaning." He looked at her over the cup. "You found the west stake in the dark. It was not hidden. Most folks would not have found it in daylight." He said only, "Good eye." She looked down into her cup. For the first time since Frost Pine Relay, something almost like pride touched her face, then vanished before it could be trusted. Outside, wind moved through the black larch trees. Inside, the cabin held, not warm, not easy, but held. On the 4th morning, Tobias dropped the coal pan. It was a small thing, a poor grip, a cold handle, iron hitting plank with a flat crash that filled the cabin too fast. Elspeth was across the room before the sound was finished. Not running, not choosing. Her back struck the wall beside the supply shelf. One arm came up near her head. The other clutched the shawl at her chest, hard enough to pull the stitched hem crooked. Tobias did not move toward her. That was the first mercy. The second was that he bent, picked up the coal pan, and set it back beside the stove, as if nothing in the world had happened beyond a clumsy hand and a loud floor. "My fault," he said. Elspeth lowered her arms slowly. I startled. "You did?" "I don't usually." He looked at the stove. "Most folks do when iron hits wood before breakfast." That gave her somewhere to put the shame. She took it. The rest of the morning passed with too much quiet in it. Elspeth kneaded dough with her sleeves pulled low. Tobias repaired a trap spring at the table. Neither of them spoke of the coal pan, but the sound remained in the cabin, tucked under every ordinary movement. Near noon, she went outside. Tobias watched from the window as she crossed the yard, past the lean-to, and followed the line of boundary stakes toward the west ridge. She did not wander. She counted. At the first stake, she stopped and looked south. At the second, she turned back toward the cabin. At the third, she knelt and brushed snow from the base. A woman did not learn that kind of habit from peace. When she returned, her cheeks were red from the cold, and pine needles clung to the hem of her skirt. "The west stake is loose," she said. "I know. It will not hold through spring thaw. I know that too. Then why leave it, waiting for the ground to soften?" She looked at him, measuring whether that was sense or neglect. "It can be braced before thaw." "With what?" She crossed to the workbench, picked up a short iron brace, and held it out. "With this?" Tobias looked at the brace, then at her. "You saw that yesterday." "Yes." "And remembered where it was." "Yes." He took it. "You notice a great deal." Her hand returned to the shawl hem. "I had to." The words came out before she could stop them. They hung between them. Tobias did not reach for them. That evening, after supper, he found her by the stove with a needle in her hand. She was not mending a tear. She was unpicking the shawl, one stitch at a time. Slow, careful, like opening a grave without disturbing the name on it. Tobias stayed by the table. You don't have to show me anything. I know. She did not look at him. That is why I am doing it. The thread came free. From inside the thick hem, she drew out a narrow packet wrapped in oilcloth and tied with black sewing thread. It was flat. Too flat for money. Too carefully hidden for letters of affection. She set it on the table between them. My name was Elspeth Vane before I married Ephraim Rowan, she said. The agency knew me as Rowan because that was the name the world left me with. Tobias sat, but slowly, giving her time to change her mind. She untied the thread. Inside lay folded papers, worn at the creases, a marriage certificate, a lant date, 3 chapel board letters, and 1 statement bearing a doctor's seal. The land is east of the Missouri, she said. 160 acres of bottom ground. My name is on the deed beside Ephraim's. His chapel board made an arrangement with him that if he died, they would take stewardship of it. Without your signature, yes, that won't stand. It will if no one asks the right question. She laid the doctor's statement apart from the others. Tobias did not touch it. Elspeth, he said, is someone coming for these? She looked toward the dark window. For once, she did not pretend not to know. Brother Pike may be. The name changed the room. Not loudly, like a draft finding the seam under a door. He sits on that board, she said. He writes like a man offering concern. He means control. Tobias looked at the papers, then at the shawl, now open and harmless in her lap. You sewed all that into cloth. I have protected information longer than I have protected myself. The stove clicked softly. Outside, one of the horses shifted in the lean-to. Tobias rested both hands flat on the table where she could see them. You are not trapped here, he said. Not by my roof. Not by that agency. Not by a dead man's name. Her throat moved once. She folded the papers back. But she did not put them into the shawl. That was the thing Tobias noticed. She left them on the table, near the lamp, in the open. Then, from the south road, a horse gave a distant call. Elspeth went still. Tobias rose and looked out into the blue-black dusk. A rider moved between the trees, far off, coming slow. And Elspeth, who had crossed half the country without asking anyone for rescue, whispered only one word. Already. The rider was Orrin Bell. Elspeth knew it before Tobias said the name. But knowing did not put her breath back where it belonged. Orrin came up the track, hunched against the cold, his hat pulled low, a canvas mail pouch tied under his coat. His horse steamed in the dusk. Snow had gathered on both shoulders like he had brought the storm with him. Tobias opened the door before he knocked. Orrin. Pass will close by morning, Orrin said. Figured you'd want your mail before the mountain shuts its mouth. His eyes moved once to Elspeth. Not rude. Curious. She stood behind the table with the papers still laid in the lamplight. Orrin did not ask. That was to his credit. He handed Tobias 3 letters and a folded notice from the relay office. Freight delayed. Notary at Emberford, leaving in 10 days for Winter Court, unless the road holds. It won't. Tobias looked toward the south road. How bad? Bad enough I turned around twice before I got here. Elspeth's hand closed over the doctor's statement. Orrin saw that. Still, he did not ask. Ma'am, he said, touching the brim of his hat. Then he rode back into the dark before the last light left the snow. The storm came before midnight. Not with warning. With weight, wind struck the north wall so hard the cabin timbers answered. Snow hissed through every seam it could find. The horses stamped in the lean-to, and the stove drew unevenly until Tobias rose and opened the damper with one gloved hand. Elspeth was already at the door with her coat on. "What needs doing?" she asked. He looked at her. Most women from gentler country would have asked how bad it was. Elspeth asked for work. "We bank snow against the north wall," Tobias said. "It will hold heat better." She nodded and took the second shovel. They worked in the dark beside the cabin, pushing snow up against the logs while wind shoved at their backs like something alive. Tobias kept the lantern low near the porch. Elspeth moved steadily. No wasted motion. No complaint. Her face was half hidden by the shawl, but her eyes stayed clear. Once, a gust almost took her sideways. Tobias reached out, then stopped. She found her footing herself. "Good." He called. "Good," she answered. By morning, the cabin was sealed in white. The world outside had narrowed to stove. Table, door, horses, water, wood. For 2 days, they lived by tasks. Tobias checked the lean-to every few hours. Elspeth melted snow in the kettle and kept the fire even. They moved the flour away from the wall, hung damp socks near the stove, rationed coffee, cut salt pork thin enough to last. No one spoke more than needed, but the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of two strangers avoiding harm. It was the silence of two people listening to the same storm. On the second afternoon, the wind made travel impossible. Tobias spread his trapline map across the table to check winter routes. Elspeth leaned over it, careful not to touch the paper. "This mark?" she asked. "Old Beaver Run." "And this?" "North Timberline. Deep snow after December." She studied the lines. "You know this place like a man knows a face." "I know it better than most faces." That almost earned a smile. "Almost." She looked toward the papers stacked beside the lamp. "I never knew a place that belonged to me." Tobias waited. "My husband's house had rooms too small for breathing," she said. "Doors that opened only when he allowed. Windows that looked out on land my name was written on, but never treated like mine." The stove clicked. Outside, the storm leaned against the cabin. The chapel board called it order. She said, "Duty, care, stewardship." They had gentle words for every lock. Tobias's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed low. "Gentle words can do ugly work." She looked at him then, fully, as if the sentence had moved something she had kept nailed down. "Yes," she said, "they can." She took the papers and laid them out again. On, by on, deed, marriage certificate, chapel letters, doctor's statement, Ansel Pike's last note, written like concern and shaped like a threat. "I do not want to hide them anymore," she said. "Then don't. If he comes." I answer, "Yes." "You do not speak over me." "No." "You do not reach for the rifle unless I ask." Tobias looked at the rifle above the shelf, then back to her. "All right?" She watched him for the lie. There was none. That night, they sat across from each other while the lamps burned low. The storm had softened from a roar to a long, tired moan. Elspeth did not take the papers back to her room. She left them on the table, weighted by Tobias's coffee cup and her folded gloves. Before she went to bed, she stopped at the door. "Tobias." He looked up. "When he comes, I may shake. That is not the same as failing." Her hand rested on the latch. For a moment, she seemed younger than her years and older than any winter. "I need to remember that." "You will." She closed the door. The latch fell into place, but the papers stayed out in the open. And by morning, the South Road would be buried deep enough that whoever came next would not be arriving by accident. Brother Ansel Pike came 2 mornings after the storm. Elspeth saw him first. She was at the west boundary stake, checking the brace she had set into the frozen ground, when a black shape moved between the pines on the South Road. Not Orrin Bell, not a hunter, not a man lost in weather. This rider sat too straight for that. His horse picked carefully through the snow, and the man let it take its time, as if the mountain itself had agreed to make room for him. Elspeth did not run. She stood with one gloved hand on the boundary stake and watched him come. The cold in her chest was old, but it was not fear. Not exactly. It was recognition. She walked back to the cabin at the same pace she had left it. Tobias was at the table, oiling a harness strap. He looked up once and put the leather down. "He's here," she said. Tobias rose. "How far?" "Less than 20 minutes. He looked toward the rifle on the wall. "Don't," she said. His hand stopped before it lifted. Elspeth crossed to the table and laid out the papers in the order she had practiced. Deed. Marriage certificate. Chapel letter. Ansel's own note. Dr. Merrow's signed statement. "This must not look like a man defending his house with a gun," she said. "It must look like what it is." "And what is it?" She smoothed the edge of the deed. "A woman with documents and no reason left to bow." Tobias stepped back from the rifle. "All right." He stood near the stove, close enough to be present, far enough to leave the table hers. That mattered. The knock came 3 times. Sharp, clean, official. Elspeth opened the door. Brother Ansel Pike stood on the porch in a black wool coat dusted with snow, his hat held in both hands. He had a narrow face, gray at the temples, and eyes that knew how to look concerned without giving anything away. "Elspeth," he said, "thank God you are safe." "No," she said. "Thank Tobias Vale. God had other things to tend." Something flickered across his face. It vanished fast. His eyes moved past her to Tobias, then to the table, then back. "I have come a long way out of concern. You have come for the bottomland." He lowered his gaze. "Almost, sadly, you always did mistake guidance for force." Elspeth stepped aside. "Come in." Ansel entered, bringing cold with him. He removed his gloves slowly, like a man preparing for a meeting he believed he already controlled. Tobias did not move. Ansel noticed. Men like him always noticed the furniture of power in a room. "Elspeth," he said, "the board has no wish to distress you. Ephraim made arrangements for the property before his passing. You are a widow in need of counsel. The land should remain under proper stewardship until my name is on the deed." His mouth closed. She placed the first paper before him. "My signature is required for any transfer. The chapel arrangement was made without my knowledge." She placed the second paper down. "Without my consent?" She placed the third. "And without legal standing." The stove ticked in the silence. Ansel looked at the papers but did not touch them. "You have been advised poorly," he said. "I have been advised late," Elspeth answered. "There is a difference." His face hardened by a shade. Not anger. Calculation. "Elspeth, public disputes damage everyone. A woman's reputation can be a fragile." She set Dr. Merrow's statement on top of the stack. His eyes stopped there. "This is a signed statement from the physician who treated me during my marriage," she said. "Dates. Observation. Notes he kept but did not speak aloud because men like you had taught the whole county." Silence. Ansel's jaw shifted once. Tobias remained still by the stove. Elspeth heard the wind press against the cabin wall. She heard the horses outside. She heard her own breathing. Steady enough. "If you pursue the land," she said, "these papers go to the territorial court. The board will explain why it sought property from a woman whose consent was never asked. It will explain why its stewardship required her obedience but not her signature." Ansel looked up. "You would shame the church." "No," Elspeth said. "You did that without me." For the first time, Ansel had no ready sentence. He looked at Tobias. Tobias looked back and gave him nothing to push against. No threat. No speech. Just a man standing where he had said he would stand. Ansel gathered his gloves. This is unwise. So was coming here? He put on his hat. At the door, he turned once more, searching her face for the old crack where fear used to enter. Elspeth gave him none. Go home. Brother Pike, she said. Tell the board the widow learned to read what she signed. He left without another word. They listened to his horse move down the south road until the sound thinned into timber. Only then did Elspeth sit. Her hands shook. Tobias crossed the room, pulled out the chair beside her, and sat close. Not touching. She looked at his hand resting open on the table. After a long moment, she placed hers over it. I said it right. She whispered. Yes. Tobias said. Outside, Ansel Pike rode away with his dignity still buttoned to his coat. But he had left the mountain without the land. Ember Ford sat below the pass with one street, one notary office, and a church bell that sounded tired even at noon. Elspeth went inside alone. Tobias waited with the team by the hitching rail, his coat collar turned up against the wind. He did not follow her. He did not stand at the window. He only held the horses and watched the road, because that was what she had asked without saying it. Inside, the notary read the deed twice. Then he read Dr. Merrow's statement and stopped looking bored. You understand what you are filing. Mrs. Rowan. Elspeth looked at the paper in front of her. My name is Elspeth Rowan Vale, she said. And yes, I understand. The pen scratched across the page. Not loud. Enough. Enough to put her name where no chapel board could rub it out. Enough to make a dead man's arrangement weaker than a living woman's hand. Enough to turn a stitched secret into a recorded claim. The notary pressed his stamp down. There, he said. Filed and witnessed. If that board wants the land now, they will have to contest you in open territorial court. Elspeth folded the copy carefully. Then they can choose daylight, she said. When she stepped outside, Tobias looked at her but did not ask too quickly. She handed him the filed copy. He read the first line, then gave it back. How does it feel? Elspeth placed the paper inside her coat, like something that stopped running. They drove back up the mountain before the late light went blue. For the first mile, Elspeth watched the south road by habit. Then, somewhere past the second ridge, she turned forward. Tobias noticed. He said nothing. 3 days later, Orrin Bell rode up from Frostpine with mail tied under his coat. He did not come inside. He only stood on the porch, snow on his hat brim, and handed Tobias a folded notice from Ember Ford. The chapel board had declined to contest the claim. No apology. No confession. Just one clean line of ink saying they would not pursue the property. Elspeth read it once at the table. Then she read it again. Brother Ansel Pike had ridden down the mountain with his dignity buttoned tight to his coat. But somewhere below Frostpine, he had counted the cost of a public courtroom, a doctor's statement, and a widow who no longer lowered her eyes. He had chosen silence. That was not forgiveness, but it was consequence. Elspeth set the notice beside the filed claim. Not hidden in cloth, not sewn into a hem, on the open shelf. The cold deepened after that. Not a storm. Worse, in its own way. A still, hard cold that put skin on the water bucket and made the horses restless in the lean-to. At breakfast, Tobias studied the sky through the window. I need to go north, he said. There is a deer run near the timber shelf. If I wait, the trail will close. How long? Day and a half. 2, if the snow moves. Elspeth poured coffee into his cup. Then leave before the light comes up. He looked at her. I can keep the stove, she said. I can watch the horses. I can split wood if the pile drops. I know. That answer warmed her more than the stove. He left in the dark with a pack frame and rifle, his figure swallowed by the black larch trees before sunrise. Elspeth latched the door after him. Then she stood there and listened. The cabin was quiet, not the quiet of punishment, Not the quiet of waiting for a footstep to turn sharp. Just a room after one person had gone out to work. She held that difference for a moment. Then she went to work too. By noon, she had packed snow around the gray mare's swollen fetlock and spoken to the animal until its ears softened. By afternoon, she had split enough wood to carry the cabin through a week. By evening, she ate stew alone at the table and read from one of Tobias's books. Slowly, because no one was there to tell her the time was wasted. That night, she went to the sleeping room. Her hand touched the latch, stayed there, then fell away. She left the door open. In the morning, she saw it standing so and did not correct it. Tobias returned near dusk on the second day, carrying more weight than a tired man should have carried. He came out of the timber with ice in his beard and a mule deer across his shoulders, walking like every step had to be decided again. Elspeth was down the porch before he reached the yard. Set it down. I'm all right. I did not ask that. He looked at her. She pointed to the snow. Set it down. Tobias. He did. His knees bent too far when the weight left him. She saw it and made nothing dramatic of it. She took his rifle, leaned it by the door, and guided him inside with one hand near his arm but not gripping. At the table, she pulled off his gloves and set his hands in cool water. No frostbite, she said. Deep cold. Sit still. You are giving orders. Observations. She said. You are sensible enough to obey them. Something like a smile crossed his mouth. Tired and small. She gave him coffee, then told him about the mare, the wood, and the open door. At that, his face went still. Open? He asked. Yes. She did not look down. I wanted you to know. He took that in like a man receiving something breakable. That is good. Elspeth. Yes. She said. It is. Later, when his hands worked again, they dressed the deer together under the last gray light. No speeches, no vows, only work passing between them cleanly. Knife, cloth, rope, salt, silence. Inside, the filed claim and the board's withdrawal notice rested on the open shelf beside his trapline map. Elspeth looked at them for a long moment. I could go back east now, she said. Tobias did not answer too quickly. Yes, he said. You could. I have land. A recorded claim. A name they cannot use against me. Yes? She looked toward the stove. The table. The cot. The sleeping room door standing open. I am staying, she said. Not because I have nowhere else. Tobias held her gaze. No, he said. Because I choose to. The words did not fill the room. They settled into it. That night, Tobias slept on the cot in the main room. Elspeth slept behind the plank wall. The door between them stayed open. Outside, winter held the mountain hard. Inside, nothing chased her. Not fixed. Not finished. But hers. This is a fictional story created for entertainment. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.